Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about KZ's AST. And if you remember, AST is KZ's new 12 BA flagship. It is a upgrade from last year's KZ ASX, which was, a 10 BA, I think, if I remember correctly. So the short story is that it carried over a lot of the traits that people didn't necessarily like from the ASX, and it refined a couple things and added some more bass. But the gist of it is it's not all that far from the ASX. And if you have the ASX, I would probably not upgrade to the AST. If you always wanted the ASX and were worried about some of the criticisms of it, then take a look at the AST. But as I said, a lot of things kind of carried through to this year's model, but we'll get into that in a minute. So here's what it looks like up close. It's got a very attractive metal faceplate. The shell itself, this is the silver version, so it's got a clear shell. And if you look super close, there's a little crossover board in there. The BAs are a little harder to see because part of the shell is frosted, so it's a little hard to actually see all 12, but from the right angle you can see most of them. So this isn't the stock cable. This is a XINHS 2-core twisted cable that's kind of custom. So this is actually nice HCK's C4I, but there's no 4, there's actually a 2. So this is a 2-core version, and it's nice and thin and light. It's a little bit tangle prone, so I'm not sure I recommend it, but nice cable so far. The stock cable from KZ is actually a nicer upgrade cable. The little knurled chrome connector, silver split, a nice 8-core SPC cable as far as KC cables go, and kind of approaches the right cable for a KZ that costs $128 or whatever it is currently. So the box is the older style box, or older, at least the same one from last year. It's kind of a Spartan box with your left, right, and a metal plate showing the model. So that's about it for accessories. There's some tips, which I usually don't use because they are the CCA style tips, and they don't really work for me all that well. So let's kind of jump into it real quick, and let's kind of run through what's the same and what changed. So the green is last year's ASX, and if you remember what even I said about the ASX and what other people said, it's got a really high level of bass, and it's not tight and fast. It tends to be a little bit boomy, and so that was about there. And so the mids were okay, and then it rose, and the lower treble, okay, but then it falls off a cliff, and people were saying it's just way too dark, there's no treble, I can't hear cymbals. So all those things sort of true, but it really mattered on how much volume has. If you add some volume, you get some more treble and you can hear it. If you're a low volume listener, this was kind of not existent, so it really had no air, had no cymbals, it was just quite dark. So when we look at the blue line, which is the AST stock, this year's model, so they added some bass, which I don't think anyone asked for, and they didn't tighten it up. It's not really all that different than it was last year. It's still quite boomy. There's just more of it. So bass fans will kind of enjoy that. Everyone else will say it probably didn't need any more bass. And I said the same thing about the ZAS. The ZAX was kind of fine and balanced, and then they added some bass to it, and it just becomes a little bassier and a little darker. And that's kind of what we have here. So blue line, more bass. The mids are kind of similar. And then the 2K rise right here, the pinna gains, is actually a little different, so it's a little more easier. But then they brought up this 4 to 5K, which is the one that kind of hits me right in the ear. It's very intense and fatiguing and piercing. So I ended up putting Tanya Filters on it, which is this red line. And so it keeps pretty much the same gain, but it really brought down the 4 to 5 area for me, which made it possible to raise the volume and to hear all the treble. So for me, it was sort of a necessary evil that this 4 to 5 is too intense for me. It's really hard at regular listening levels to listen to that 4. That, if you remember the KB Earlark 4K, it's a very piercing, almost hyper detailed sound to it that hits me right in the ear. And so the filters kind of got that right to where it needed to be. But, you know, when you look at the blue and red lines, the treble itself, you know, maybe there's some slight differences to it, but the gist of falling off the cliff and having a much lower upper treble with not as much air, lower cymbals, all that stuff kind of carried through from last year as well. So yeah, generally it's slightly different, but pretty much more of the same, with more bass is what it came down to. So let's kind of walk through some things right here. So as I said, the lower treble, that 4 to 5K range on this guy, too intense. So I use Tanya Filters, and if you're not familiar with that, they are filters that are given with your Tangent Tanya, and it's that black filter laid right on top of the AST nozzle grill. So just slap it on there, and you end up with, it's not always clear what happens, which part of the treble is going to be affected, and which part's going to be reduced. But on here, it hit pretty much the 2K stayed about the same, and 4 to 5 was very reduced. And for me, just reducing that intensity let me bring up the volume to where it needed to be. So, as I said, necessary evil, but in the long run, it really helps me bring this to a much more long-term, longer session set than it is with that 4 to 5K peak. So as I said, volume, I said this about the ASX, you have to raise these guys quite a bit to hear the full range. And if you're a low volume listener, it's just going to sound super dark. So got to get the volume up, but if it's bring it up too much without filters, too bright, too intense, so you got to work on that somehow, either EQ or filters or whatever you want to do. But if that 4K area is of concern to you, like it is for me, then got to do something. So the tips, these happen to be the KB Ear KB07 set. I'm not sure why these work on this guy, but they tend to work for me. And what you're really looking for is to control the boom. Too much boom, too murky, too dark, all that stuff. Tips on the other side, too wide, becomes too bright, too intense, but it controls the boom. So you're kind of looking for a middle ground between the boom and that brightness. And for me, that's what these guys did. I settled on those, and I kind of kept on using those. But do tip roll this one pretty heavily because you're looking for that middle ground where it sounds good for you. So what does it sound like? It's this warm, bassy V shape. And I think with filters, it brings down the upper range enough for me where the timbre is much better. It sounds a lot more natural for me. And it still has that booming KZ fun bass. The stage is actually quite nice. And especially on mid-centric tracks where you don't have a whole lot of bass to muddy up the sound and the imaging, the stage is actually pretty nice. But what it really comes down to, and what the ASX had the same problem, is it's very playlist dependent. And we kind of went over this with the ASX. Well, some people would say the ASX actually sounds pretty awesome on my tracks. And you post a few tracks, and you're like, oh yeah, it sounds pretty good on those tracks. And then someone else will post tracks, and be like, yeah, not so much on those tracks. So you really have to find the sweet spot. And for me, the sweet spot is, music that is very much mid-centric. Anything that goes too bassy gets too boomy, and it's too murky and dark. Anything that relies on too much in the upper treble, it's still going to sound dark because its level is so low. So if your treble head is going to sound quite off because you don't have enough. If you're a bass head, it's going to sound pretty good because it's nice and boomy and fun. The mids, depending on how much they slide over, take on too much bleed, but just having a mid-centric track sounds pretty good. So very much playlist dependent is how I would call it, and you sort of have to pick and choose your battle as to, is this thing going to sound good or bad depending on what songs you like to listen to. So let's run through some tracks that I like and dislike on it. So we'll start with Massive Attack Angel. For you sub-bass fans who like to test rumble on your sets, Angel is a nice track, and for this one especially at volume, It's very percussive and it slams quite hard and it goes quite deep. It's sort of everything that I wanted in a deep, bassy track sound like that. Like I said, it's not the tightest, it's not the fastest, but it's fun. It's kind of a bit loose, and but you're not going to listen to that track and like, oh, the sub bass is kind of rolled off. It's yeah, it's kind of all there. So next, Metallica's Whiplash. So those opening drums, big and boomy, they sound tons of fun. You know, it's kind of a shocking, wow, those are really big drums. And then the rest of the song, you know, those blazing guitars come on and it's set out right to your ears. So I wasn't actually expecting this because the vocals, there's kind of a nice vocal image right in the middle, super clear, quite a bit of clarity there, but the drums or the guitars are set quite wide, and then the other drums are kind of behind them. So you end up with this really nice arrangement, this presentation on a crazy fast song that I was assuming was going to sound like a big mess. Actually sounds quite good. So quite impressed the way that all gets arranged. And if you got a 12 BA set, you got to try something fast anyway, because that's where the BA advantage is. It's much faster than a single dynamic driver trying to do the same kind of songs. And yeah, if you ever pick that song on a cheaper dynamic driver, it's just kind of a blurry mess. But yeah, kind of a nice, surprising track. And like I said, those opening drums, and then you hear them again at 126. They're just not quite as defined and as sharp as they should be. It's just a fun, casey bass sound is how I'll call it. So Harry Styles' Golden. If you ever played the song on a couple different IMs, it ranges from dark and murky to not enough bass will sound quite bright. Like you only hear the upper end of that whole song. So on the AST, like I said, it's just a murky, dark version. And anything that goes kind of goes back to this boominess. There's so much bass here that carries over into your mids that when you're hearing both the same, so Harry Styles singing over a very heavy bass line just sounds like a big muddy murky mess, and so you end up hearing basically vocals and drums is the only thing you could really get out of that song. So not a great one for the AST. So Gautier is somebody I used to know, you know, just a couple Spartan things, right? His voice, couple instruments, her voice, you know, not a big bass heavy track, doesn't rely on a lot of treble, sounds really nice. It's everything that you kind of wanted in a 12 BA because his voice has nice body and nice detail, and a lot of the other tracks that follow that pattern are going to sound really good at AST. And I think the same thing happened on the ASX as well. It's like once you're in the zone of those mid-centric tracks, it sounds really good. Just don't go too bassy where it murkies things up and it sounds quite good. So the female version of that kind of song, Tove Lo's Passion and Pain, and the whole track title is something crazy long, which I don't remember, but her lower female voice is just weighty and kind of smoky and full. And then as she goes on throughout the track and her voice raises up a little bit more, you really get a sense of the dynamics on this set. And it's not range constrained like sometimes the dynamic driver, which they constrain it between, you know, it almost sounds like they let the bass kind of ride and then they pull in the treble so it doesn't go a bit wonky and the whole thing sounds a bit constrained in range. And so that sounds quite nice on the AST as well. And but yeah, her voice, dynamic and intimate, detailed and texture, and it gets better as the song goes along. And her voice raises a little bit and it sounds a bit sharper. Yeah, it's just, I think that's one of those songs that happens to sound better on a BA than it does on a budget dynamic driver because of the detail and the edge and the sharpness and texture and all these other things that you get out of, you know, you don't need 12 BAs, but it helps to have BAs. So take a step a little further. For those of you who haven't checked out Agnes Obel's The Curse, it's a very cool song. Again, another lower female, detailed, those strings that are plucking, very detailed and sharp. It never feels blunted. Like I know it's 12 BAs, and it probably doesn't sound like it's 12 times more than one BA, or, you know, 3 or 4 times more than 4 BAs. 12 BAs is probably overkill, but, you know, to hear a song like this and those strings and the violin and maybe that part at 1 minute starts to resonate and sound a bit wonky, but, you know, the whole thing in that whole midsection sounds quite nice, and her voice is full. It's a bit forward of the plucking, and the strings are in back of her. You know, the violin is maybe a bit above. The whole staging and presentation, quite nice on that one. And again, you just don't have that bass to murky it up, and you're not relying on too much treble to bring in the detail. It all just kind of fits. These three all are very mid-centric, kind of falls right in the sweet spot of the AST. So then a little further, Go-Go Penguin, Signal and a Noise. Again, a little bit too much low end, that piano low end and that lower drum, they just dominate, and it gets a bit murky. The snares sound a bit soft, not enough treble, so there's no real edge to it. They just sound kind of a little blunted. The balance is just off. It just sounds a bit dark. So Cafe, Demars, Viva, Cuba Musica. Boy, it's this lower treble. Even though I have filters on it, the tips, you know, it hits you right in this spot, in this lower treble spot, very much in your face with those horns and the droning bass. And it's the double whammy of too much bass and too much lower treble on that song for me anyway. And then kind of at the very upper end, Deadmau5's Strobe. Everything is just a bit dark. Again, it's really hitting this whole lower area here. It's just struggling to soar and sound like strings should sound like strings. They just sound a bit darkish and dull and a little drab, and just not, there's not enough air or level or anything in the upper treble, so it sounds a bit off. So that's about it. That is my take on the KZ AST. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.